Hi guys, and welcome to another week of RYA Sell From Home, the final week of RYA Sell From Home. This week we're going to be looking at pre-start strategy, and it's going to go a little bit further than just pre-start. It's going to be looking at just things we should be taking into account when we're on the water in order to help us plan our sessions, and whether that be plan our training or plan our racing, they'll apply to both. So we're going to break it down into three main sections. Section number one is going to be observations you need to make about the weather and the conditions when you first get on the water, and some actions you're going to take to dependent on that weather or conditions. Section number two is related to the course, so whether it be a slalom course or a windward leeward course, or a different type of course, doesn't matter what type of course it is. That second section is all about the course, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And the final section is the more specific strategical stuff. So some little exercises and sort of tick box bits that are going to give you some information to help you formulate a plan to go and execute during the racing. And those are related to a few things. It could be start, the type of day it is, what sort of breeze there is, and things like that. And I'll go into that as we go on. Okay, so starting with conditions observations, I've got a few videos here, and as you will see as they play through, the conditions are pretty obviously different. And what you can see, again, quite obviously, is that the settings of the sailors in those videos are very, very different. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at from that conditions observations section is the conditions. So what does the breeze look like on the water, and how does that affect us? Now, this is something talked about doing things when we get on the water, but this is something we can do even before we get on the water, and will save you a lot of time and wasted energy when you get on the water if you use that information well. So the information we can gather before we get on the water, well, one is obviously our wind forecast, but in this video I want to talk more specifically about some observations we can make on the day that are in real time. So the main observation we can generally make when we turn up to a venue is, what does the water look like and how windy does it feel? Okay, so if the water looks rougher, there's white caps, and the water is darker as well, then obviously that generally means it's a lot windier. And if the water looks a lot calmer, clearer, then it's a lot lighter, and we'll feel that as well. Now, I know this might seem quite obvious, however, a lot of people don't use that information on the shore and translate that into actions to do to their kit. If you make those observations of what is going on the water before you get on the water, then you're going to be a much more equipped, much better setup for when you do get on the water, and you're going to save yourself lots and lots of energy and hopefully be going full speed straight away. So tip number one from conditions observations is work out how windy it is and get your kit set up roughly to those conditions. Now, we talked about settings before you get on the water. Here's a video of two of the lads changing some of their settings for the conditions on the water and getting tuned up and set up for the conditions they are feeling at the time. Okay, so section one is all about those settings. So we need to make sure we observe what is going on with the wind, which, although I've highlighted, I think most people probably do that already. As a step on from that, we then need to translate that into actions. So changing our equipment in order to be best set up for the conditions. If you're not sure on how to do that, There's a video a couple of weeks back that explains some outlines for and some settings guides for some certain conditions. And again, if you have any problems or questions on how to set up in certain conditions that weren't answered by that video, then drop your coaches a message or drop me a message. Okay, so section 1, what do the conditions look like, and am I set up right for them? First on the shore, second on the water. Section number 2 is observations of the course. Okay, so this is a really basic one, but again will save you huge amounts of places, particularly at internationals, where things get a little bit more confusing. So the first thing I want to highlight from this section is a very simple one, and that is when you get out to the course area, you need to make sure, one, before you get out to the course area, you make sure you know exactly what the courses might be and how they're going to signal that. So generally there are a number of courses, whether that be windward leeward, a slalom, a trapezoid with an inner or an outer loop, and they'll be specified in the sailing instructions. And they're usually displayed, there's a sign displayed on the back of the start boat, the committee boat, highlighting what course they're going to use. So once you get out to the course and you see what course they're going to use, you need to identify what marks are where and work out exactly where they are. This is something that's often missed at internationals, and people end up missing marks because areas get really busy, and it's hugely important to make sure you know where you're going and you don't just follow the person in front of you. Okay, so here is an example of what you would see in a sailing instructions, and these are the 3 courses that the UKWA tend to use. Now on the left hand side there, you can see they have in the box the signal, so that will be displayed on the back of the boat, highlighting what course they're going to use. Once you've seen that, you then need to work out exactly where each mark is. So it's a good idea to study the sailing instructions before you go on the water, so you know what marks are where. Here's another example of some very similar stuff, slightly different from the ETs. Now the reason I put this one in there is because I just wanted to highlight that not all sailing instructions are the same, not all course signals are the same, and therefore it's really important to make sure you read the sailing instructions for every event you go to. So as we know in windsurfing, conditions can be very changeable. They can be changeable in an instant, or they can be changeable over the course in terms of distance. So if we take the first one, for example, when they change in an instant, often on days when the wind is offshore, or it has a lot of obstacles in its way before it gets to the course, you find that the wind is very shifty, and it changes in angle, sometimes every minute, sometimes every 5 minutes, sometimes every 10 minutes. Now the shorter those periods are, the more tacks we're going to have to do on the beat. The longer those periods are, the less tacks we're going to have to do on the beat. And the reason for that being, I'll try and explain this simply, is that we want to spend as much time on the tack that takes us closest to the mark. And if the wind shifts, it might take us further away from the mark and the other tack closer, so we tack onto the other tack. And that's really simply put. I know I've brushed over that, but unfortunately not got time to go into that in too much detail. So yeah, what's really important though is we have an understanding and awareness of how often it is shifting. That is the most important part, because then we can start to predict how many tacks we might have to start putting in on a windward beat. So my first bit of advice for section 3, which is your strategy section, is when you get to the start line, you want to do what's called some headings. So you're going to sail off the start line at the same point a number of times and see if your angle changes off the start line. The number of times your angle changes was roughly the number of shifts that you've experienced. Now if you time that, you can probably work out your beat on average should be around 8 minutes. So you can expect, if you do that for 8 minutes, you can work out how many shifts they're going to be roughly on your beat, and then you can start to have a think about how many tacks you might have to do, and you can add that into your strategy. Okay, the next part of the strategy is, and this is on a different type of day generally, so maybe not on a shifty day. We're now moving over to what we call more of a game feature day, so a day when there is something on one side of the course that makes it better than the other side of the course. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Sometimes there's just more breeze on certain parts of the course due to less obstacle, or some funneling down a channel in the mountains, or it's being pressured against the coast. Many reasons. We might have more wind on one side of the course. Another thing we might have on one side of the course is more tide going and helping us in one direction or against us. And then the other thing is we might have a slightly different wind direction over on the other side of the course, again due to some land features and things like that. Okay, but so they're the technical things, but what we really want to just find out, we want to keep this really simple. It doesn't necessarily matter too much the theory behind it. It's really good to know the theory, because then it helps you work it out on your own and helps you answer a lot more questions. However, if you're new to this and this all seems quite complicated, then you can really simplify it just by getting out onto the water and doing what is called a split tack. Now, a split tack is where you and a partner meet up at the bottom of the course by the start line. You set your watches for 2 or 3 minutes and you sail upwind in opposite directions. After 3 minutes of sailing, you tack back and come back to the middle again. So you carry on sailing upwind and you will meet in the middle. Now, whoever comes out first, say if the person who has gone left upwind comes out first, then that would mean that the left hand side has a gain on it. If the person that went right comes out first, then that would mean the person on the right has the right hand side has a gain on it. Now this doesn't work too well on really shifty days, because the shifts mean that one side is probably not going to be favourable all the time. However, on some more consistent days, this is a really, really good tick box exercise to help you get an understanding of which side of the course is paying. So tip number 2 for your strategy section is find a partner and do some split tacks. Okay, my third and final tip for your strategy section of your pre-start is the start line. So making sure you know where the bias is on the line. The bias is the first gain we can make on the course, and is a really, really important one. Often because race offers are pretty poor at laying start lines, and therefore there's a big bias and a really big gain to be made early on in the race. Now, the best way for you to work out the bias, well, there's a few ways to work out the bias. One way is to get someone, again, to get a partner. Both of you sail off each end of the line at the same time, one on port at the port end, one on starboard at the starboard end, and if the starboard person crosses the person on port, then it's starboard bias and vice versa. The second option is to work out which side of the line, which end of the line is harder to reverse to. So if it's hard to stay upwind while reversing to the starboard end, then that means it's starboard bias. If it's hard to stay upwind while reversing to the port end, then that means it's port bias. Now, the more you get to thinking about the bias and you practice that, the more it becomes a lot easier just to sail up to the line, have a look, and get a good idea of what the bias is. But as I say, that's one of the early gains we can make, and it's really important that we find that out. And that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour on pre-start strategy. I haven't gone into too much of the specifics. I've just given you an overview of what you should be doing. Now, if you go out and do all of those things that I've suggested, that you go and try pre-start, the more of it you do, the better understanding you'll have of it. And the easier it is to then ask your coaches some questions and for them to answer them. So go out and practice it. Make sure you get it done, and you will find that you're windsurfing, you're maximising your efficiency on the water, you're maximising your efficiency on the course, and therefore all of a sudden you'll feel like a loads faster windsurfer. Thanks again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the whole sort of series of videos, and hopefully they'll be useful in the future. As always, message me if you have any questions, and I'll see you out on the water very soon.